Top of the hour. This is Louise Jackson. I am the Director of Alumni Career Services here at UC Riverside's Alumni Association. It looks like we've got a number of participants on the call today, so welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited for today's session. Encourage you to ask a lot of questions. I'd really like the session to be interactive, so please post those questions in the Q&A feature box at the bottom of the screen. I want to be able to assist you. The goal of the session really is that you can walk away feeling that you can have the confidence to go into your job interview. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. So before we jump into the slides, let's talk a little bit about the title of today's session. We're talking about interviewing with confidence. We know I've worked with a lot of clients, a lot of alumni, a lot of private clients when it comes to preparing to job interview. And interviewing can be one of the most important stages of the job search. It's really where someone gets to assess your potential fit with the organization. The interview really is sets up your value proposition for the potential organization and really sets you up for the next stage, which is negotiation. So this stage is really key. Confidence, I wish there was a silver bullet when it comes to interviewing. I wish it was something as simple as, there was some kind of secret sauce to say, hey, just do this and you're good. But really what I've seen repeatedly again and again over the years is that nothing can equate hard work. Putting the effort and the time in to prepare yourself for the interview. Nothing can equate that. Whether you are trying to get into a dream position, a position that you've been considering for years in a dream location, you're trying to get that promotion, you're trying to get that increase in $10,000 in your salary. When you think of it like that, how much is 5 to 10 hours of work? Not that much. So from that perspective, I really would encourage you to walk away from today knowing that you need to put the time in to make sure that this works. So let's jump into our content, and it looks like I'm having some toggling issues here with my slides, so if you don't mind holding for 1 second, I just want to make sure that, and please feel free to let me know if for some reason you're having a challenge with your visual and you're not getting a good visual on the slides here. My apologies in advance for any kind of technical glitches that we're experiencing. I just want to make sure that these slides are showing. It looks like we're still having some trouble here. Okay, thank you so much for your patience. Let's jump in here. There we go. Thank you so much, everybody. So I know real life is really messy, and obviously we don't all go through these phases in perfect in synchronization, but when we're working on the job search, these are some of the key phases that you go through. Taking the time to really understand yourself, defining your target organization, your target position, refining your brand. By that I mean your resume, your LinkedIn profile, but not only that, your professional communications, how you're speaking, and the sense of professional competence, your value proposition, your promise of value that you're sending to a prospective employer. So your branding also includes your communications. The next piece is obviously your networking strategy, so coming up with a defined networking plan that would allow you to advance in your career development. The last piece I like to talk about is interviewing, and in this stage I also include performance review or performance evaluation if you're seeking a promotion. So let's talk about interviewing. When I think about interviewing, we really consider 3 large buckets. And whether these are addressed directly or indirectly in the interview, these are things that are always asked, again, directly or indirectly. The first is you need to know why you. Why you? Of all the people out there, why you? You need to understand yourself. You need to be able to really be able to express that in the interview. The next one is why this position? You need to know the position. Read the job description. The number of job seekers who don't actually dig into the job description can be rather surprising. And the last one, why this organization? Be able to say something about the organization. Again, a number of job seekers who don't really do any research about the organization that they're interviewing for. Be able to identify some key things about the organization that you're going into. So why you? Why this position? Why this organization? So let's dig into each of these three main pieces. Why you? This is really what I consider the roots of the tree for the job seeker. The job seeker, you need to understand yourself. How does this fit in with your long-term career plan? What are your interests, your skills, your motivations? Rather than being a passive job seeker and going into the job simply because, why not? Why not apply? I'll throw my hat in the ring. That really comes across in the interview, and that comes across when you haven't taken the time to reflect on yourself and how this fits in with your career goals. Focus on your strengths. What are your strengths? Be able to articulate them and identify them. Why do you really want this position? This is probably, again, like I said, the roots of the tree. If you cannot articulate what's happening under the ground is then what's expressed, verbally in your interview, in your communications with your employer. If you haven't taken the time to spend here, this really comes across in your job interview. Why this position? Taking the time to really dig into the job requirements, the responsibilities, opening up Excel, mapping out in the left-hand column what the job requirements are, asking yourself, do I have these skills? Do I have a background here? If you want to even in this column on the right, fill out specific skills you have or stories related to those job requirements. So really taking the time to analyze the job description, to understand what's stated there is very important. Next one, why this organization? Understanding the organization, a little bit about the organization through reviewing their company page, their financial statements. If they're publicly traded, their financial statements are available. Financial statements can allow you to understand where the organization's priorities are, what their direction is. You also need to understand their culture, their size, their geography, understand the names and the titles of the individuals you're interviewing with. So really taking the time to do some LinkedIn and some Google searching. And I gave the example here of UCR alumni. Going into your job interview, being able to say, yes, I understand that there are 115,000 alumni here at UC Riverside. And again, speaking to my role here with UCR alumni. So taking the time to really understand the organization is very important. So we've talked about the big three. Tell me about yourself, or why you, why this position, and why this organization. Now let's get into some of the fundamentals. Okay, so in addition to these three, I'm going to give you some frameworks that you can really use to address some key questions. The first thing we're going to talk about is tell me about yourself. This is a loaded question. It's an opportunity for you to really set yourself apart from your competitors. It's a defining question in the interview. I would say this is in the first few minutes and really sets the tone for the rest of the interview. Actually, you could say that your employer or prospective employer has already made a decision from answering this question before you even get to subsequent questions. Framing transitions. Employers are really, really interested in transitions, more so than other aspects of your career development. They want to know why you left your last organization. You need to be able to address that. Mastering stories. We want to talk a little bit about the key aspects of a story. We want you to master 4 to 5 stories that then you can use in a behavioral interview. We're going to look at some of the top 10 questions, just so that you have a handle on some of them. We're going to talk about your questions. What are the kind of questions you need to ask the prospective employer? And then we're going to talk a little bit at the very end about putting in that extra effort. And again, like I said at the beginning, this is really probably with individuals that I've seen succeed or not get positions, comes down to how much work you're willing to put in to prepare for the interview. So tell me about yourself. This is a great question. It's probably the one question you can count on getting in an interview. You need to be able to address this succinctly. There's different frameworks out there for how this question gets answered. And if you Google this, you'll find all manner of different suggestions. One of them that is relatively common is the past, present, future framework. I prefer the framework that I have up here because it really allows you to speak to the future. It also allows you to be succinct, to not get lost in the weeds. You know, I went to high school here, I did this in the past. So I really encourage you to consider using this kind of framework. So the first thing you do is address your professional identity. Who are you? I am a software developer. I am a aspiring aspiring mechanical engineer if you're still a student. I am in my case, career coach. I am so come up with your identity descriptor. This doesn't need to be your job title, but it needs to be something that encompasses who you are in a professional sense. Then a little bit about your skills and your background, okay, your skills and expertise. So I am, in my case, you would say I am a career coach with skills in all aspects of the job search, including interviewing, including resume review, interviewing, job preparation, networking, and placement. Okay, or I am a software developer with specific skills in, and you list out some of your actual code that skills that you have. Okay, so I am a with skills in X, Y, and Z. Your most recent position. Most recently, I have been with, that's where you list out the organization and the title that you had. So, you know, for example, in this case, most recently, I've been with UC Riverside in the role of Director of Alumni Career Services and Young Alumni Engagement, a key achievement, and the scope or the result. So I'm proud of the fact that during my tenure at, and you know, for example, let's say you were with a company during my tenure there, I was able to do X, Y, and Z, a little result, a little bit of my background. This is where you list out degrees, job titles, relevant skills. If you have a graduate degree, here's a good chance to make a plug there, a little bit about my background. I have a master's in. And then the last piece is really important. What is the tie back to the job that you're applying for? I'm really excited for the opportunity to contribute to the team at X in Y. So really build in that tie back as the last piece of that framework. Okay, so really use this framework, practice this. You shouldn't take more than 3 minutes in the tell me about yourself question. Make sure you get this right. This is loaded. It's a very important question in the interview. Reframing transitions. Like I said, companies really want to know why you left your last organization. So be able to address those in a succinct way. And again, just a reminder, ask me questions. That's what I'm here for. So reframing those transitions, being able to address why you left your last organization is very important. Employers really care about this. When we're talking about transitions, if for any reason there was a negative reason that you left your last organization, whether there was downsizing, whether there was conflict at the organization, whatever the reason, or a career switcher, maybe you're going from one industry to another, you want to focus on the positive. A lot of job seekers tend to speak negatively of previous employers. Definitely a big no-no. As much as is possible, focus on the positive, depersonalize as much as you can, and make peace even internally with yourself so that when you address this question, you yourself are at peace. I like the idea of adding a moving on statement. So let me give you a little example of how you might do this for a career switcher or someone who's making a career transition. And I use this framework. I pursued X. What I liked about it was Y. Why I needed to make a change was Z, leading me to my current position at A. Okay. So for example, here's a little example. I may not read the entire example, but I think you get the gist of it as it pertains to this framework. My most recent position has been in global health research, where I could marry my attention to detail and quantitative statistical skills with my interest in public health issues. Okay. So maybe someone whose main focus was on research and data sets. I love working on large data-driven projects for publication. However, what I missed was, okay, this is where you say, I liked it. What I liked about it was, this, but what I missed was this. Okay, so I missed having any policy-making influence. That was always up to the large funded lobbies and foundations. Hence, I am seeking to make a shift where I can still conduct that research, but where I can make an impact through policy proposals. Okay, so use the framework if it's a career transition. If it is a downsize or a conflict, again, focus on the positive. So focus on what you learned and then focus on that tie back to your prospective employer. What you really like about the position as posted and through your research is the following. Okay, so focus on the positive as much as is possible. Let's talk about mastering stories. And again, I'm kind of getting a little tired of my own voice, so please ask those questions. Want to make sure that I help you as much as I can. So when you think about stories, everybody needs to prep in their back pocket before they go into that interview 5 to 6 stories. You need to be able to the premise of this kind of aspect of interviewing is that past performance or past behavior is a predictor of future performance and future behavior. That's behavioral interviewing. The majority of interviews use something in this regards. So you need to have 5 to 6 stories or examples. What I'd like you to do is map those out. So open up Excel again. In the left-hand column, you have your list of job requirements. In the right-hand column, you have your story, okay? And you canoodle those stories and you fit them into where they need to go based on the job requirements. Each story needs to have 3 main components. It needs to have context, telling the reader, set up the problem, set up the scenario. It needs to have the action that you took, and that should be the majority of your time. So I would say 80% of your time should be spent on that action that you took, and that needs to have a result, okay? So context, action, result. Slightly similar format when we do resumes, but that is action, context, results. So if you've taken the time to really work on your resume, and I'll give a plug to our resume guide and to some of the resume resources we have, take a look at those. If you spent the time on your resume to do an action, context, result, you just flip the formatting and you have your context, your action, and your result. So here's an example of someone who does operations efficiency. So the order entry processes at a large auto manufacturing company where I worked were up to 10 days late in shipping dates. Okay, that's the context. You set up the problem or the situation. Then the action you took through assessing large amounts of data and conducting, we have someone who raised their hand. So let's see what we can do for you. Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit if that's okay with everybody. We have a great question here about career transitions. Do you have any suggestion of, for framing a transition that is for a very similar position, responsibility, and salary, but a smaller organization and a better title? And so there may be a lot to this question that I'm not privy to in terms of, let's say you're trying to segue from potentially, I don't know if it was a negative situation at a previous employer and you're trying to segue into a positive scenario. Maybe you're doing it for work-life balance, whatever the reasons. I would say from the, that's the red flag or the elephant in the room. When there's a lateral move or sometimes even a move down, you want to be able to address that succinctly. I would really take the time to research your prospective employers. So understand their mission. If their mission is, let's say, if a lot of this also depends on if it's in the nonprofit space or in a different kind of space, but I'm imagining if the mission of this new organization is something that really resonates with you, that would be something that you could use to then address why you're trying to make that switch and even why you're willing to make a lateral or a move down. Or another thing would be if you've really put some research in and everything about that organization, again, speaks to you, resonates with you, then it's something that you really, again, that's a way to make that answer positive versus just focusing on the prior employer, which could potentially be negative, which is really not something that you want to do. So hopefully that answers that question. Another question we had was about incorporating stories other than when asked about a time when you had to resolve a conflict. So again, the stories are for when you actually get that question. So I wouldn't try to use a story when not asked, if that makes any sense. If you asked, for example, tell me about a time when you used one of your strengths, or what are your strengths? Can you tell us your strengths? That's a great opportunity to use a story. So the stories do fit in with a good amount of the questions, but don't just use the story just because you prepared it. Hopefully that helps answer that question. All right, and it looks like I had a couple more hands raised, so I'm going to see if I can get to you. Still figuring out, let's see how this hand raising function works. I believe. Okay, I think I addressed the majority of the questions that have come in. If you have further questions, raise those hands again. I believe there's a way I can actually have you talk, if you don't mind using your voices so that it's not just me. We'll have you use your, I'll have you actually speak up. You can even ask these questions in person. So raise those hands, please don't stop. I want to make sure that these get answered. Okay. We have a great question here about stories, the 3 categories for stories. Okay, so let me jump back to that slide that we had prior. So jumping back in here to our slide deck. My apologies, for some reason this slide sharing feature is giving us some hiccups today. We're having some trouble toggling back and forth. Here we go. Okay, so when it comes to mastering the story, so here, for example, in the left-hand column, I took a job spec or job description. I pulled out what I considered the top, 5 to 10 job requirements. One of them was quantitative analysis. The next one was project management. The next one was cross-functional lead. So these are things that are identified in your job description. In that left-hand column, you consider, do I have a good story about quantitative analysis? Do I have a good story about project management? Do I have some good stories about serving as a cross-functional lead? So that's where you identify the job requirements and you match them with stories. So hopefully that addresses that question that came in. Looks like we actually had another one. Okay. All right, so going back to our context action result. So you provide that context. For example, the operations efficiency person, he said, listen, I identified this problem. Here's what I did. Here's the action I took. I assessed large amounts of data. I conducted root cause analysis. I used pivot tables and other solution generating techniques and was able to uncover a sub-optimization flaw and re-engineer sales and order entry. Okay, so this is the action I took. And then the last piece, a lot of job seekers forget this, resulting in savings to the company of $768,000 annually. Okay, so you give that result piece as well. So really make sure that you build those stories. Don't forget that result. So don't just give the context and the action. If you can, even if it's not quantitative, try to include a result. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so we still want to make sure that there's some questions that come in that we may not, we want to address the common top 10 questions. We've talked about tell me about yourself. You're going to practice your framework. We've addressed the question of why are you interested in this organization? Be able to address the mission of the organization. Something about the organization that really resonates with you personally and professionally. We've talked about the potentially difficult question of why you left your last position, be able to reframe those transitions. We've talked about stories. Tell me about a time when. Stories also go great with question 5, greatest accomplishment or failure. Stories can go great with question 6, strengths or weaknesses. Think about question 7, what is your work style? Be able to think about this. Remember, the interview is also an opportunity for you to understand the organization and their culture. So talk about how best you work, what kind of environment you like to work in, what are your future plans. This comes up again at the very beginning when I talked about why you understand yourself and how this position fits in with your career development. Salary requirements. This is it could can be a challenging one. So before you go into that interview, take a look at glassdoor.com, take a look at salary.com. Again, the majority of interviews should put that negotiation stage once they've made the offer, but that may not always be the case. Remember that you need to be prepared for all eventualities, so be able to address this as needed. We are going to be doing a session on negotiation, so I would encourage you in November, so sign up for that webinar where we'll be talking specifically about how you have this kind of conversation, how to anchor, and all the detail around negotiation. But you still need to be able to address this at minimum. And then being able to talk about getting along with your last supervisor is another key question. Okay, next big piece, your questions. This is something that sometimes gets missed in preparation. We spend a lot of time preparing for the tell me about yourself, preparing for all other aspects of the interview, and we forget about our questions. If you need to, keep these 3 big buckets, excuse me, in your back pocket. So strategic questions, questions about trends and challenges that are facing the organization are really important. So for example, from your perspective, what are some of the big trends or challenges facing X? With these in mind, how might this impact the team and even this role, for example? This may be a question they push back on you potentially, but it's a great opportunity for you to even understand the landscape that's affecting your organization and the industry. So strategic questions are great, trends, questions, challenges. Job-specific questions. So if you've done a lot of reading about the job posting or the job description, you've done a lot of you would like to understand more about the job itself, this is a great opportunity for you to ask. A great question is, what are some of the key accomplishments that you would like to see in this role over the first year, or in the first 90 days, or in the first 6 months and then following? So asking about, how your performance will be evaluated is a great question, and the key accomplishments and the vision that organization has for this position. Wrap-up questions are always useful. So asking about the next step in the process, what's the timeline like? Is there anything else you can clarify with regards to your candidacy? Again, reiterating your commitment and your interest in the position. So again, kind of going back to something I mentioned earlier, not being that passive job seeker, but reiterating that you really do actually want this job. So strategic, job-specific, and wrap-up questions are the 3 big buckets that are useful when it comes to your questions. Last but certainly not least, putting in the extra effort. What I've seen again and again with alumni across the board and over the years is those individuals that take the time, take a Saturday, spend the time preparing, putting in that extra effort, is always going to be successful. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning, confidence comes from practice, and confidence comes from putting the time in to prepare. So if you can bring a portfolio, a brag book, PowerPoints, that's very helpful. Coming in really thinking about your plan in the first 90 days. So be able to address, even if it's in a slide deck or even in some kind of document, to say, I took the time to understand your organization. And the data that I could find, here's what I did. And I know that obviously I would come in and first understand existing, platforms, programs, and roles. But I also want you to know that I really thought through this. And here's some of the things that I came up with based on my research. And here's what I would do. That really shows that you've put in the effort and the forethought. into the role itself. Something even that I have heard from clients that go that extra mile are they've even received the financial statements from the organization. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if it's publicly traded, those financial statements are available to you. Understanding where the organization's at and then coming up with that 90-day plan can be really helpful. And then the last but not least, taking the time to practice, verbalize, stand in front of the mirror, ask yourself, tell me about yourself. I am a software engineer with skills in X, Y, and Z. Okay, so professional identity. Remember, I have a background in. I'm very proud of the fact that. Okay, so use the tell me about yourself framework. Practice that. Practice your transitions answer. Practice your stories. Nothing will really match that practice. And then the last piece, I would be remiss not to mention, don't forget your thank you note. Send a thank you note if you're doing a panel interview with multiple individuals. I would recommend emailing them individually. It really sets you apart rather than a blanket email, which tends to be more generic. But don't forget the thank you note. If you are going for the old school written card, that's fantastic. I always like to augment that with an in-person, with an email. Nowadays, we just don't know, if a decision's going to be made before they even get that snail mail thank you note. So make sure you also then send an email in addition to. And I'm going to quickly look at our Q&A piece and see if we have any additional questions. All right, so we have a question from someone who's a young alumnus, and it looks like they would like to address some of their experience that's professional in nature, but may have been during their time as a student and not necessarily in their existing position, formal employment position. So the question is, at what stage could you mention either classwork or work done while in school? I'd love to mention this to companies, but they seem to care more about what I've done in the real world. So this question kind of encompasses a little bit of what you would be doing in your branding as well as in your interview. So starting again, if we went back to that initial slide where I laid out sort of the overall phases that you would go through, I would say the first thing you want to do is really figure out how you can build that theme into your resume. So if you're within 2 to 3 years of graduation, you still can put education at the top of your resume. So that's one way to draw more attention to that. You can build a professional summary in your resume that really identifies and that really tries to draw attention to, for example, in your case, I think it seems like it's marketing. So you would say, for example, marketing, in your professional summary, you would identify yourself in your professional identity as aspiring marketing professional and, maybe something related to your existing role. But again, trying to reframe that theme so that the attention is where you want it to be on your goal of marketing and on that experience at school is very important in that resume. This is something we can also take offline. If you'd like to send me an email, I'm happy to assist you with this. So building that in the branding. Then in the interview itself, what I would do is I would come up with some stories of marketing or classwork or projects. Those stories are just as relevant, even if they were as a student, to the prospective employer as something that you've done in a formal employment. So building in those stories is another great way to address that. I would also potentially build in a little bit of that marketing component in your tell me about yourself. So there's a lot of different ways where we can get at making sure that that theme is coming through if your employment has been in an industry that's not related to your undergrad degree and that you're trying to go for. So hopefully that is helpful there. Are there any additional questions? It looks like we have a couple more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and answer them. If you had a panel interview, do you send each individual a thank you card? So that's a great question. I think I did kind of address it earlier, but I would say yes. Panel interviews, it's best to individually contact each of your interviewers. I would suggest sending an email to each panelist, thanking them, and I would reference a key aspect of the interaction that stuck out to you. You really want to make sure that you're top of mind with them. So for example, thank you so much. I really enjoyed finding out more about organization X. And I really appreciated being able to ask about why. Again, reference something specific in that interaction that took place. I like to customize based on the individual. So for example, if I'm interviewing or if you're interviewing with a specific person, you're able to look them up on LinkedIn. You can see where their specialty is. Think about how their program, department, unit, or role would interact with yours in that role, and say something like, I really look forward to learning more about what you're doing and how our programs might collaborate. Okay, so find out more about them and reference that in that thank you email. That could really set you apart. So individual emails, I would then augment that with, if you wanted to really set yourself apart, those individual thank you notes by snail mail. I will say nowadays most interviewers anticipate emails. Of course, it's a nice touch to have the thank you card, but I would say definitely think about making sure you at least do the email. We had a question about being authentic during the process. And I think that's very important. You know, we really want to be ourselves. We want to bring our best self to work. And I know that this varies by industry. Some industries definitely tend to be slightly more casual and less conservative. If you are interviewing in the tech space, for example, that tends to be a lot more casual with less sort of strictures around you know, communication, professional dress, and things like that. If you are interviewing in finance, law, some of the more conservative environments, there is a little bit more pressure to definitely bring a little bit more of a conservative approach to the interview. So again, doing the research on the industry is important. I would say when it comes to this, we really still want to be ourselves, because when we're ourselves is when we really shine. I would balance that by saying that that doesn't necessarily mean we let everything hang out. So be authentic, but that authentic still needs to be with your professional hat on. So I know we all wear different hats, right? We've got an employer hat, we've got some kind of family hat, we may have a parent hat, we may have, you know, a sibling hat. Remember that ultimately, unfortunately, are still wearing that employer hat. And when it comes down to this, employers are assessing your promise of value to them. And that may sound harsh, but that's the question they're asking themselves, is what is this individual's promise of value to us as an organization? And so that does come down to how you carry yourself and how you convey that promise of value through your communication and your dress. So I do recommend, you know, I wouldn't say not being genuine or authentic, but taking the time. I think what helps is also practicing, because that way you don't quite feel so canned. The interview is a very particular kind of environment, and so also would just encourage you, if you're feeling discouraged, interviews are rather odd. They can feel very canned. Do the best that you can in terms of trying to be yourself. So definitely long-winded response there, but hopefully that helped. We have a question about advice on thank you notes for outside staff panelists versus inside. Very interesting. So somebody works in the public sector, and unless I happen to know someone on the panel through networking, I'm sometimes at a loss as to how I might personalize my thank you note. So this is where potentially LinkedIn Premium could be helpful for those of you who are in the job seeking stage. I wouldn't recommend it for everyone, but it does have its perks in terms of being able to access LinkedIn profiles and get a little bit more information about individuals. I would say that what I find really helpful, but sometimes a challenge when you're in an interview where there's multiple individuals, is taking the time to really write out their names. If you don't even have their contact information, it's appropriate at the end of the interview to ask for that information if you would like to do that. That's perfectly appropriate, so that's something you could do. So make sure you write down their name and their title so that you can then do that research. So as you're sitting there, have that pen and paper handy, you look up, you smile, you take down their name and their title so that you can then follow up later. using LinkedIn Premium to see if you can find out a little bit more about those external panelists that you may not know about can be helpful. If you cannot find absolutely anything, it would be fine to still send a generic thank you. It's better than nothing, might be generic, but you really still want to make sure you get that thank you in. So hopefully that answers that question. And it looks like we still got a couple of minutes here, so I'm not sure if there's anything else you would like me to reiterate. Somebody who wants to actually ask a live question, I'm very happy to, facilitate as much as I can here. Is there anyone else on the call that would like to ask a question? Raise your hand, and I will try and get to you. No one? All right, well, I think, let's see, we do have one of our attendees, looks like they raised their hand. Okay, so I'm being told, Rhiannon, that you're using a slightly older version of Zoom, and so it's not giving you that access to talk. I'm going to promote you to a panelist so that you should have availability to talk. So I think you should receive something pinging you. And I think you should be able to ask your question. So one of our participants, Rhiannon, is going to ask a live question. Rhiannon, it looks like you are muted, so you probably want to unmute your microphone to be able to ask your question. And the microphone button is on the bottom, all the way across. Just click on that. Otherwise, if that doesn't work, you also can type out your question as another way we can get at this. All right, it looks like still muted. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for today's session. I also want to encourage you, if you are in the job search, if you've had a couple of challenging interviews, remember that all it takes is practice. This is definitely something that you can master. Use some of the frameworks that we've identified today. Feel free to reach out to me. My email is louise.jackson@ucr.edu. I am the Director of Alumni Career Services and Young Alumni Engagement here at the Alumni Association here at UC Riverside. You can also take a look at our website. That is alumni.ucr.edu/career services. Everything I've covered is actually going to be there. We also have a number of career guides on resume, interview preparation, negotiation. Everything is there. A recording of today's session will also be sent to you subsequent after our session today. So please feel free to take a look at this at a later date. And it looks like we are at time here. Rhiannon, again, if you would like to get that question answered, please feel free to email me directly at louise.jackson@ucr.edu. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. It was a real pleasure, and hopefully today's session was really helpful for you. We do have one more question, and I'm quickly going to answer it since we have a couple of you still on the line. So somebody asked about applicant tracking systems in large organizations. So applicant tracking systems, definitely something you want to think about. We've had a number of sessions, webinars through the Alumni Association with regards to using LinkedIn, increasing your SEO, applicant tracking systems. What I would do if I was applying at a large company are a couple of things. The first thing I would do is I would jump onto Indeed and I would identify 5 job descriptions for the same kind of position. So for example, let's say I'm going for a specific role, I'd find 5 job descriptions. I would go through each job description, identify the same keywords that are used across all 5 job descriptions. So in other words, that's where you're identifying some of the keywords that are going to be used by recruiters when they're doing that actual search on their job applicant tracking system. It's like a database, kind of like LinkedIn. They're going to be looking for certain words. So 5 to 6 job descriptions, identify those keywords across all 5. What are the ones that are used repeatedly? Make sure you use those in your resume, in your application, and in your cover letter. So use the same keywords. The second thing that I would do is I would put the networking strategy before the job application. So I would do an informational interview with someone at that organization. I would then email them and tell them that you've applied for a position. It may not happen, but in these kind of cases, you may then be referred to HR and they will pull your name out of the applicant tracking system to at least get your applicant looked at in that initial phone round that you usually have in that first round. So please feel free to reach out to me again. I'm happy to talk to you about ATS systems and how you might circumvent those through some various strategies. So that's something that I'm happy to help with. All right. Okay, we had a question about someone who was laid off or how you address that. Awkward question, definitely something you want to address. I would say, again, we want to depersonalize. We want to add a moving on statement. So what I would say in these kind of questions is, again, like I said, always trying to be positive. So using the framework, you know, I worked at X, what I liked about it was Y, but looking for a change to Z. And that's why, you know, I'm very interested and invested in your organization and what you're doing here. So I would use the same kind of framework to answer this question. And that is on this slide deck. We can go back to that. So again, keeping it positive. Adding that moving on statement. And by that, I mean a tie back to what you like about the prospective employer. So that's something that I would do. I would use the transitions framework that we addressed in an earlier slide. All right, and it looks like I did actually address all the questions. If I did not get to it, please send me an email. Happy to assist further. Thank you so much, everybody.